gives me great pleasure to introduce the speaker for the next grand opening keynote, Ronnie Screwvala, whom I have known for more than 20 years. Ronnie wears many hats with elan and ease. He's a first-generation entrepreneur, founder of India's most diversified and biggest global media and entertainment conglomerate, UTV. And now, after the acquisition by Disney, managing director of Disney-UTV. He's also managing trustee of the Swadesh Foundation and founder and advisor at Unilaser Ventures. He was named on Esquire's list of the 75 most influential people of the 21st century, ranked among the 100 most influential people in the world on the Time 100, and listed among 25 Asia's most powerful by Fortune magazine. Ronnie started his journey by launching the first cable TV network in India. From there, he went on to build a media and entertainment giant, which the Walt Disney Corporation bought in 2012 for an enterprise value of $1.4 billion. Ronnie also puts a great deal of emphasis on social welfare. He created a foundation with a focus on rural India that has adopted over 200 villages in Maharashtra to work on their self-sufficiency in water, health, education, and livelihood, and has a plan to impact over 1 million people in rural Maharashtra in 5 years. Last but not least, he also has a keen interest in mentoring the next generation of entrepreneurs in India, and in many cases supporting them with his own investment as well. The keynote will be moderated by Lata Krishnan. Lata is the chair and co-founder of the American India Foundation. She is also the chief financial officer of Shah Capital Partners and a board member of the Silicon Valley Bank Financial Group. Please join me in welcoming Ronnie and Lata to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Morning.
Morning.
What a privilege it is to have you here, Ronnie, with your wife, Zarina. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you for having me here.
Well, let's start with, you're a famous media mogul today. Let's start with how you started with being a toothbrush manufacturer with 2 second-hand pieces of equipment from London many years ago.
I guess that's the first trick question. Well, I think that spells out what entrepreneurship is all about, actually. It was a coincidence. I went in with my father just as a sort of a tour guide into a brush manufacturing. They were disposing 2-year-old machines away as scrap, and I said, can I buy them? They said, what are you going to do with them? I said, I'll figure it out when I get back to India. And that was the beginning there. So that was just a sort of a straddling before the media ambitions came about.
Mm-hmm. Who were the early influences in your life?
Well, I think it varies. I think in media, at that stage was a very, very initial phase of industry. And I think those were early days to really have mentors. And I think that was, part of the challenge. Mm-hmm. So I'd say it's really, we were discovering it as we went along.
And how do you think, I know you have a love for theater, how do you think theater helped you develop your persona for entrepreneurship?
I think theater or any part of that is a very important one for confidence building. When you and I did that as a hobby, but when you're sitting out there and standing every weekend, we used to do that as a hobby there, with 1,000 people, the level of self-confidence, your intuitive sense and your ability to think as you go, just builds that up, and that's a sense of confidence that I think has made me and has actually inspired me in many ways.
Would you say that part of your magic is that you're impulsive and a doer? I've heard a story about you jumping out of your car when there's been a huge traffic jam and trying to direct the traffic yourself. Is that true?
Well, I think that's my daughter's favorite one because I keep doing that and she keeps trying to hold me back. But I think that goes to the thing where, at least out here, everyone feels if you can drive in India, you can drive anywhere else in the world, which actually is not true. Because if you can drive in India, I would suggest you just stay driving in India. And the same goes for a lot when you look at, everyone says if you can drive in India, then you can do business in India. And I think I've never figured out what the corollary of those two are. But yes, I think impatience is not something that comes that easily. And sometimes you're just seeing it out there, you're seeing the solution right out there, 4 cars, nobody wants to move, and something needs to be spoken to.
True entrepreneur. So you've been a first-generation entrepreneur, and that's not common in India, given that most people come from family businesses.
I think it was less common when I became an entrepreneur. It was definitely less common. And you know, I think unlike here in Silicon Valley is pretty much the dream world where you want to be an entrepreneur. It's just something that's so coveted. It's unique. Even today when I interact with a lot of young people, and it was there very much when I was turning to be an entrepreneur, where actually everyone felt, and the qualification in India is, if you really can't get a good job, that's why you became an entrepreneur. And your marriage market is actually down if you're an entrepreneur. So on your CV, that's a little bit of a shaky part of the whole situation. It sounds like the father-in-law would say, so you didn't really get a job, right? So I think those are some challenging ones. But in a more serious note, I think that needs to be evangelized, and that needs to change and evolve in India. And people need to see a lot more success stories. People need to see it being sort of, you know, evangelized in a much larger way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it was early days then, and I still think, except for a few of the metropolitan cities, it's still a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. Great lead-in for my next question. For those aspiring entrepreneurs in the audience who perhaps are contemplating working with their spouse, what would you say about that?
I think that's perfectly fine. It just works as to, I think when Zarina and I started, we founded the company together. At that time, we were not actually husband and wife. We became husband and wife much later. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that necessarily makes a difference. I think we draw from each other, strengths from each other, our ability to be able to, and a woman's instinct is always much more powerful than a man. And I'm not saying that because my wife is here. That just normally holds out very strongly. So if you put all of that together, I think it makes a great team to work.
You've been sort of a pioneer of cable TV and home shopping in India. Tell us the journey of the media business in India and where you think it's going to go for the next 5 to 10 years.
That's a pretty long question, but I'll try and see how I can encapsulate that. I think early days in cable TV and home shopping, pretty much over the last 15 years, I think in media specifically, because it's still a very nascent industry, it was all pioneering. And it's a learning process, because I strongly believe there's a very thin sliver between pioneering and being before your time. Mm-hmm. And that sliver is actually quite a very thin slice. And I'd say that at least 4 out of the 10 times you kind of fail because you were before your time. But I think we didn't have a choice because it was very early days for almost everything else. So while we were building a company, we were also building an industry. That makes it doubly challenging. But I think it also creates unique opportunities because you can be path-breaking. You can actually script a lot of the things that you want to do. The mindsets are a lot more new, don't need to be changed. And I think sometimes that works in people's favor. Today, I think we're at an interesting cusp for media in India. Primarily because I think, you know, outside of the fact that it's such a large market, and we know all the statistics of about 1 billion people and being the youngest country in the world, but I think it's a very strong influencer in mindsets. Mm-hmm. When 70% is still in rural India, and most, you know, outside of their 2 square meals, it's the TV set in the house and the mobile phone. Mm-hmm. And therefore, they're much more connected. So there's an aspiration even in rural India today that wasn't there a decade ago. And I think a lot of that has to do with media and television. Everyone knows about our Indian film industry, which everyone calls Bollywood, though we like to continue to call it the Indian film industry, and it is a very strong influencing factor. So in a sense, if you look at that, I think the next breakthrough for India, we're still a $15 billion media industry. We should by now have been a $150 billion industry. There's no question about that. And I think the biggest culprit for that is that the consumer does not yet pay for what they consume in India in terms of content in any form. And I think that's going to change rapidly over the next 5 years. I think broadband, with some of the large investments that are happening in India, we're going to leapfrog just like we leapfrog in telecom and we leapfrogged in IP. I think in media we're going to leapfrog with connectivity and internet. We're one of the least connected internet countries, but I think we're going to be some of the most connected ones in broadband. If we just take these 2 ecosystems of the consumer paying for content and a broadband, I think we're set for this being a 10x media industry over the next 5 to 10 years. Mm-hmm.
And you know, the media industry has been a fairly local and fragmented industry in India, and you've had the sort of luck to have private equity firms like Warburg Pincus and News Corp and Michael Bloomberg and various others funding this industry. And how would you say that happened? I mean, what was the impetus there?
Well, I think I think luck, by the way, means you need to be in the right place at the right time.
Certainly.
And you need to know exactly what to do with that opportunity when you're in the right place at the right time, because otherwise everyone can blame everything else on luck. So I'm a firm believer in that. And I think for us, the first time we invited private equity with Warburg Pincus, it was their first investment in Asia and their first in media from that perspective. And I think later on when News Corp came in, and then actually when Bloomberg, that was a unique tie-up, because 3 years back or 5 years back, we knocked on Bloomberg and they said, look, anywhere in the world we do not allow anyone to talk content unless we produce it. And we said, well, we can't do that in India because there are foreign direct investment regulations. And then 3 years later, I knocked on their door again and I said, look, we've created some credibility and just allow us to use your brand name. And that was the first time ever Bloomberg allowed any company outside of the United States to use their brand name. And I think now they use that model everywhere else in the world. So in a short span, I would say in one word, it would be credibility.
And value creation is always something you've done really well. And as you think about the acquisition that Disney had over your company, they haven't really ever acquired anything in India. And so how do you think that marriage occurred, and what was it about UTV that particularly propelled them?
Yeah, I think, well, Disney I don't think has acquired anything outside of the United States, and Marvel, Lucas, and Pixar being some of them. I think the trigger was, first, it's a local market. And I think we had a fantastic 5-year relationship before that. They acquired, we created a local kids channel, which actually overtook the Disney channel. So they knocked on our door and said, do you want to sell it? We said no. And finally, they acquired the channel, but they acquired a minority stake in the company. 2 years later, when we wanted to grow, they upped their stake. And then we finally decided a year back that we'd consolidate, and Disney bought the entire company, including my shares, and we delisted the company. So I think the idea there again was a very strong local market, a very strong management team, and let's face it, in the media industry right now, if you're looking at emerging markets, it's really the only place to be. China, that way, specifically in media, is extremely regulated. So India is really the beacon.
When you think about the valley here, we're always about entrepreneurship, and the exits and sales of companies are sort of typical, perhaps less so today than it was 5-10 years ago, but nevertheless a hot topic. Whereas founders in India, at least we think, are more obsessed with control and ownership, and so the exit, in fact, is somewhat of a dubious word. So in that light, you too have received criticism about this acquisition.
Yeah, actually I wouldn't say criticism in that context, but I think the question comes back again to the entrepreneurship. It's not a coveted word, it's about you didn't get a good job. So if you look at that, serial entrepreneurship here, when you talk to everyone, is said with a sense of pride. There it's kind of your repertoire, and you sort of start whispering the last 3 words when you say I'm a serial entrepreneur. You kind of soften that up there, just less anyone says, but what do you mean by serial? Is it a serial killer? What kind of... And that's the connotation that I think has to come down quite strongly. So I think for people, because India has a culture with strong family businesses, and the obsession for control has been very, very high. And I think that's something which I do divide. The minute you sell 1% of your company to private equity, it's no longer your company. And I think that differentiation in Indian entrepreneurs sometimes doesn't happen, where you have to segregate a CEO or a managing director position from being a shareholder. And 51% obsessive control, I think, is one of the reasons why you haven't seen so much of scalable companies coming out of India. Because I think if you did that, you'd find a lot more in terms of scale. So I think I'm in the small minority of people who believe that, once a shareholder and wealth creation is on one aspect and management is on another aspect.
But then if you take the sort of the converse question of the founder entrepreneur having to bring perhaps professionals into the company at a certain point, how do you view that from an entrepreneurial standpoint? At what point is it appropriate for a founder to think about bringing professionals in to scale?
I've heard this for almost the last 2 decades, and I'm quite confounded. Sometimes I think it comes from a certain sector that says, either you're an entrepreneur or you're a professional. I mean, I don't understand what the difference is in that context. Because I think the combination, I'd like to say 2 things. I think a fair amount of that also, I think, came from the venture capital community.
Yes.
everywhere else, and I know there's a fair amount of that here, so I don't want to get too much of the angst there. But I do want to actually state, and it's been my experience over the last 15, 20 years, because we've done a lot with private equity people. I sometimes find, and I've said that very candidly, when it comes to private equity or venture capital, you know, like an MBA student or a management student, when you want to do your MBA, you first go out for 4 or 5 years, and you actually work, and then you go and do your MBA. Right. I strongly think that in venture capital, everyone who wants to be in private equity and venture capital should first run a business for 4 to 5 years and then become a venture capitalist. Because I think that's the real difference, because I think otherwise it's great input, but sometimes it's theoretical. You're pushing companies for top line, whereas actually you should be focusing on bottom line, you should be focusing on people, but somebody wants growth, somebody wants cost cutting, but actually you need to take a 5-year view. That instinctive sense would be very different if you looked at it, if you had actually had that experience yourself. I
think great point, and I know my husband for sure would be very happy to hear that. I know that you view Bollywood as a smaller aspect of your accomplishments.
We're getting down to Bollywood now.
Yes. Okay. Well, you know, we have to cover your diverse accomplishments. But we have a diverse community here in the Valley who identify with India through many lenses. Bollywood or the Indian film industry is one. And so as you think about, you know, your success with Rang De Basanti and the hundreds of other, well, the 199 other movies that you've funded and produced, what do you think is your unique strategy? I mean, you've been in this game for 10 years. The industry has been around for over 100 years.
Yeah, 2013 is 100 years of Indian cinema. We've actually been there only for 10 years. When we kind of went in there, we were just a listed entity, and everyone thought we were absolutely crazy getting into film industry. What the hell did we know about it? It was an extremely incestuous industry. But actually, it's one of the most creative hubs there is. At the end of the day, the core is you're creating something out of nothing. Now, in technology, you're creating something out of nothing. In a creative aspect, you're creating something out of nothing. And I think that's a very unique field. We decided very clearly that the first thing we wanted to go in there is to understand who our audience was. And the audience was a lot more broad-based. It was really the family, because family single-genre movies were really the ones that worked, because that's how the community. But when you cut down to the sliver, the core 15 to 24, we felt as an age group was underserved. So we first looked at how do we make content for that core audience. The second was, this is an industry where to change mindsets would be very difficult. Why don't we work with people with absolutely fresh mindsets? So we worked with a whole host of new directors and a whole host of new talent and scriptwriters. And I think that was the breakthrough for us. And then finally, it is about instinct, and it is about backing your instinct. Like it is when you're working on a product. It's not very different from that perspective. So I think a combination of core being the sort of 15 to 24 age group, looking at slightly different narratives and grammar, going with your instinct, but at the same time, a very strong commercial sense. I think we were very fortunate for all of us to have a strong sense of creative, being creative catalyst. And I think that is the operative word if you want to survive in the media and creative field.
And do you think you'll develop this industry more to cater to the diaspora community outside of India?
Well, not really. I think, you know, this constant quest for a crossover movie, I think, is a fallacious objective. Because firstly, a product anywhere, if it's not for a core audience, can easily get orphaned. If it's not for your core audience in your own home-based country, and it is for a global audience, it actually can get easily orphaned. So I would not recommend that that is something as a segment that one should be looking at. But we're the second largest migrant population in the world outside of the Chinese. There's 30 million, 40 million Indians, and about almost 45 when you come to South Asians. So that's a pretty large diaspora outside.
So speaking about the Chinese, they've really made serious investments in all the continents, really. So as you think about expansion from India abroad, what are your thoughts there?
I think we've been late at the game. I think there are a couple of industrial houses that have done well. I think in pharmaceuticals, people have made some very astute investments and done pretty well. I think the Tata Group in the UK have made some strong investments. One of them, I think, in steel has not done as well, but their acquisition in automobiles, outside of being checkered, has done actually pretty well. I still think it comes back to the 51% control context, where if you want to start building conglomerates with worldwide objective, it's different. please understand that I think when large multinationals in the US and the rest of the world look at the global, they're actually looking at putting footprints of their very well deep-seated products or offerings to a global community and a global consumer. When you're looking at some of the emerging markets doing that at the reverse, their objective for acquisition is a very different element of growth, international growth, but not necessarily something that has been so well developed in India, which you now want to put a footprint. So it's a different reasoning, therefore a different culture. And if you don't get the reason for why you're expanding overseas, you can get it very wrong.
Just looking at sort of the environment, the ecosystem, I personally, being an entrepreneur myself, feel that the ecosystem in the Valley is magic. That's what encourages us entrepreneurs to move forward. So when you compare the ecosystem in India to what is available here, how do you feel that impacts innovation?
Well, this is the cup that's half full and cup that's half empty. I think the ecosystem is poor because, well, firstly, entrepreneurs are not respected. Second, we don't have something where people want to make an investment in intellectual property or take a 5-year or a 7-year view. So there aren't any people who say, here's what it is, you develop this, I'm backing you and going forward. Venture capitalists and angel funds are very, very rare. Indian funds are extremely rare from that perspective, and we, having now started to invest in some of these, realize that we're actually loners in that space. And most of them come from an overseas perspective. So it's very, very low. At the same time, I do believe that when you're looking at innovation overall, from an Indian perspective, we'll have to look at this as a very different. I think India can be phenomenal in innovation. I think what we're going to be great at is frugality, for example. It's cost conscious. For most of the world, we're creating product for the top 1 billion people consuming it. But a couple of countries will have to create products, services for the other 6 billion to consume. And I think that can come from out of India. So it depends. In India, are you going to get the most high-tech car? No, you're not. But you're going to get the nano if the brief is that this is for a market for the people who are two-wheelers but now want to aspire to become four-wheelers. You're going to get it from a Unilever that decides, for example, that they can't sell a whole bottle of shampoo because of price to the Indian consumer in the rural villages, so let me break it down and make it a sachet, and so on and so forth. So I think the innovation aspect from India, and that's sort of the word, the operative word used in many aspects is jugaad, is really about the fact that you are going to innovate with a very cost-conscious approach, and I think that's something we're going to excel in.
Going to a different topic now, something that's very close to my heart. I've spent 12 years with the American India Foundation, and so it's of particular interest. Tell us a little bit about your journey in social entrepreneurship. You and your wife have started the Swadesh Foundation, and it is said that your family has committed $47 million to this foundation, working in education and health and clean water. And I love the 4 E's, engage, execute, empower, and exit. Speak to us a little bit about your vision there.
Sure. Just as a word, I want to sort of clarify. Social entrepreneurship, I think, is going to be very, very big in India. But I believe that social entrepreneurship needs to be for-profit, and social needs to be not-for-profit. And I think the two need to be segregated. So Swadesh for us is really social. I think it stems from the fact that 70% is still rural in India. If we really want India to be one of the top 3 economies of the world, we're not going to get there outside of actually changing leadership or great leadership and all the other things that we keep reading about in the media and press, is if we don't in some form transform the 70% of rural India. Yes. And I think it's going to be the very, very sort of obligation of almost everyone to do that. So it's not some 1 or 10 or 20 individuals that are going to be able to do that, but everyone's got to be able to put their own input there. In the 6 months that Zarina and I did a lot of research on Swadesh, and we spent a lot of time to see what really was, if we wanted to bring our entrepreneurial skills into social, what did we need to do that was different? And in 6 months, we met just a lot of people. Tremendous work being done by a lot of NGOs, but in a sort of what I would call fragmented manner. People were expertise in education, and then we realized, but you can do education, but if the villages don't have water and they don't have health, how are we going to get education to the next level? So it was touch points, but no permanent change. And I think, again, because I've been accused a lot of being the serial entrepreneur, I think that learning or training came to me, and I said, we really need an exit strategy for rural India. And to us, therefore, for Swadesh, we define that as we go into a village, look at it from a 360-degree point of view, which is still very challenging because most people focus either on water or health or livelihood or education. But we decided that we need to have touch points for all four. So create strong verticals in all four. And have a plan that we can exit that space and exit that village that will never require social work again. And we've put a timeline of 5 years. Now that 5 years may switch to 6. So for us, the critical mass was we can do that in 50 villages, but will that create a model that others can follow? So I think we've committed to adopt 1 million people, to look at this as 360 degrees and look at a 5-year. And a lot of people in the team have questioned that says, don't keep articulating 5 years wherever you go because it could be 6 or 7. But if you just look at that element, I think that will be transformational. And I think if you're looking at something that you had work experience on, you need to have execution foundations. And I think that's really what we are. We're not there to cut a check. We're there actually to sit down there, build teams, and run it like an organization.
And does an exit include partnering with the government or other organizations?
Actually, the exit actually is one word, the livelihood element of those people. Because at the end of the day, no human being can have a level of self-confidence unless they're earning for their own selves and for their family. That sense of pride you can only do. So we've got to go from that 20,000 rupees annual income, which is $400, to a 1 lakh rupees, which is still $2,000. But we want to make at least the people in our villages lakpatis.
India is again not high on the philanthropic index and giving. You know, it's a perception. It's not. I think actually it's not just a perception. Americans are well known for being really generous, not just in their own communities but globally.
Yeah.
How do you think we can get there?
Well, firstly, I think the simple theory is you first need to have in order to give. So, you know, it's nice when you have.
A lot of people in India do have.
Yes, I do agree. I do agree, and I was asking for that, but I still want to state that you first do need to have to be able to give. And I know we have a 0.2 to 0.3% of GDP versus US, which is 2% of GDP that goes into philanthropy. But I would like to state 2 things actually, which is really the handicap first. First, in that 0.2 or 3%, we are not actually evaluating the sweat equity that goes into philanthropy in India. And actually we cannot underrate that, and I'm not using that as a justification. But the volunteerism and the execution NGOs and foundations, if you take the man hours that have been contributed in social in India by the people, I think that would double the input there just there. That's still not an excuse for the money flow not to come in.
Great point. Yeah.
I think the other part I would say is that the monies haven't really flown in because there's been a credibility issue. Most people want to cut a check and don't have the infrastructure or the time and ability to execute and follow that through, just haven't felt good about where the money is going. And I think when that changes, when there are companies or organizations or foundations like us that will have a monthly impact report that people can relate to, you'll see the purse strings loosening up substantially.
But taking that a little further, just broadly, not just about social entrepreneurship, but as you look at the sort of credibility index for India globally, whether it's on the business angle or social entrepreneurship, despite the fact that India has a burgeoning youth population and a great GDP growth rate, the fact is that it is steeped in a lot of it is steeped in corruption and in a lack of infrastructure. How do you, as a as someone who's been so successful in business, what do you think people like you can do to make that playing field more level?
It is a very difficult one. I do want to state that, in 1995 we had China and India and everyone, the rhetoric was very high about two countries that could really get out there, and we definitely dropped the ball, not once, not twice, maybe 5 or 6 times. I think under the auspices of being a vibrant democracy, which I think we are, and we're extremely proud of being that, comes consensus management. And I think the last 10 to 15 years, consensus rule of law and consensus rule of management and leadership has not really worked. And that is the crux of it. So when you get down, and I think the corruption is really come from a historical part where basically even entrepreneurs, you could be having the brightest idea, but somebody goes out there and actually gets one license, and he can be a multi-billionaire based on a license, not necessarily an innovation or an idea. That's really a change of the ecosystem that has to take place. But I think right now we have a leadership issue, but to be fair, a leadership issue without mandate and without power will continue to remain one. Do we think we have an immediate solution? No, I think the situation can be quite grim and may continue to be grim. I think today the youth is a very strong voice of electorate. I do believe in 2014 we're going to have a whole bunch of people that are going to come in there. The key aspect is, do they know with clarity what choice they have in front of them? I'm not sure. But I think right now our hope is really on the youth of India to be able to not accept a couple of the status quos and take that as a change. But on this one, it is a grim situation.
Well, I can't tell you what a treat it is to listen to someone like you who's been successful in business and who embodies such great value systems in conducting not only his business but also for the community at large. So as you reflect back on the years and you think about your relationship with your parents, who I know were very important to you, what do you think, do you have any regrets, and what message would you have for the young in the audience who want to aspire to be like you?
You know, in entrepreneurship, it's always very, very difficult to encapsulate what are the key things that one would kind of look for. But I think my learnings over the last 15 years, being an entrepreneur, 20 years actually, one clearly has been just stay the course. There is no way you're going to create value unless you actually completely stay the course. Massive amount of resilience, and I know we've all sort of heard that enough times, lots of ups and downs, but staying the course is very, very critical. I think the second one is building trust and credibility. I do believe that's a bit of a problem. It's in the Western world as it is in India, where the quick buck concept is very, very high. You're not going to be able to build trust and credibility. So short term, and it's nothing to do with the short term and the long term, because every time you look at the long term, everyone says, well, 5 years sounds like a lifetime. It's continuous trust and credibility building internally with your employees, with your consumers, and your investor community will pay you rich dividends. And I think this audience here understands the PE differentiation between credibility and non-credible organizations. High governance and non-high governance would be the other. One of the things that has worked very well for me is whenever there's a huge crisis, you sort of just reflect in your left brain, what's my worst case scenario? And if I can handle the worst case scenario, the problem kind of fades away. It doesn't go away, it kind of fades away in its intensity and allows you to take a much more objective point of view. And I think that's something that I think is a strong learning for me. And fourth, not in a rank of many, many others, I'm a strong believer that all glory is fleeting. So it's great to pop a bottle of champagne and celebrate, but the next day it's business as usual. And if you don't, complacency sets in, and that's a big challenge. But overall, I think those will be the four sort of highlights of my learning over the last 15, 20 years.
Well, it's been a real, I think for us, I think I'm not the only, I think I speak for the entire audience when I say that it's really a privilege to have you here, and you are the promise for us for India.
Oh, lovely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. Excellent. Lovely. Thank you.